For everyone near and far for joining us this evening for a special webinar hosted by the Mitvim Institute on a historic occasion, the announcement by Israel and the United Arab Emirates that the two parties will be seeking the correct language for an accord in the coming weeks or months. This is really an incredible opportunity for all of us to dissect and kind of analyze the developments that are taking place across the region, much of which are happening at a rate that is very difficult to keep track of. And the news that's been coming out since the announcement on Thursday has further enlightened us as to what's been happening behind the scenes. And for the purposes of a much broader and international audience, we thought that it would behoove us to invite some of our esteemed colleagues to speak about their experiences, their knowledge and background, and to kind of frame the events of the last couple of days, both within a historical space and also to look towards the future. A couple of important ground rules before we begin. The format that we have this evening is a format that will include four. I'm going to introduce our speakers one by one, and then afterwards we're going to have our speakers give about 5 to 7 minutes of conversation on their specific angle and area of focus. And there are a lot of different ways that we can tackle this conversation. In addition, my request is that there are many, many more of you than there are of me, so please place yourself on mute. That way everybody can enjoy and be enlightened from the words of wisdom they're going to be shared this evening. My name is Gabi Mitchell. I'm the Director of External Affairs at Mitvim, and I'm happy to host this event. The Mitvim Institute, for those of you who are less familiar, is now in its 10th year. It is a foreign policy institute that has been focused for a decade now on trying to both create and identify opportunities for cooperation between Israel and its neighbors, both in the Middle East and in Europe and elsewhere around the world. So the news of this the last couple of days has directly been tackled by our experts and analysts over the last couple of years. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers for this evening. First, we have Ksenia Svetlova, who is the Israel-Middle East Relations Program Director at Mitvim, a research fellow at the IDC Herzliya, and a former member of Knesset. She's an accomplished journalist who's fluent in multiple languages, and Ksenia publishes regularly on regional developments in the Israeli media. We also are going to be hearing from Dr. Moran Zaga, who's a policy fellow at Mitvim and the academic coordinator of the Chaikin Chair for Geostrategy at the University of Haifa. She's a researcher on the Arab Gulf and focuses on the United Arab Emirates in particular. We will also be hearing from Elie Podeh, who is a professor at the Department of Islamic and Middle East Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and a Mitvim board member. His upcoming book, From Mistress to Known Partner, Israel's secret relations with states and minorities in the Middle East, explores the history of clandestine relations between Israel and other regional actors. And finally, we will hear from Dr. Nimrod Goren, the founder and head of the Mitvim Institute and a teaching fellow at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Thank you to all of our speakers for taking the time to be with us this evening. I'd like to first start with Ksenia. Ksenia, you know, the last couple of days have been just a whirlwind, but perhaps you can ground us in some basic information, some real facts. What did Israel and the United Arab Emirates actually announce? Why is this announcement happening now? And what are the steps that led to the announcement in a better way to understand what should be coming in the coming weeks and months?
Thank you very much, Gabi, and good evening to everybody, or good morning if this is the time that you are having right now. Regarding your first question about the content of the agreement that is yet to be signed, and we also do not know exactly when it will be signed, then there were more question marks than actual information. I will, of course, quote what was written until now and what was reported by Arab media and also by the Israeli media, that we are going for the normalization agreement, although both sides, not only Netanyahu, but also Mohammed bin Zayed, repeatedly called this agreement the peace agreement, Muahadat al-Salam. So this is very interesting because framing this as a peace treaty seems to be much more sexy in a way than just normalizing their relations for both sides, probably. So we are talking about the agreement that will lead to the exchange of the diplomatical missions that will be started in Tel Aviv and in Abu Dhabi. The Israeli mission is already on its way after disagreements about separation of various responsibilities between members of the delegation, but they are already on their way to Abu Dhabi. And it seems to be the easiest part because then the delegation of Emirates is supposed to reach Israel and then start the negotiations about establishing here diplomatic mission. What kind of diplomatic mission? Yet to be finalized, although what we heard from the Emirati leader is that there will be no embassy. There will be no full diplomatic relations. There will be no embassy until there will be no real progress between Israel and the Palestinians. And although we are very hopeful in Mitvim, and we also support with our both hands the resolving of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, but we are also aware that this might take a while. Okay, so establishing a consulate, establishing some kind of a diplomatic mission, not yet an embassy. Trade, yes. Investments, yes. Tourism, yes, although again there are no clear information about the realization of this deal. When it will be signed, and also it's a very political question, much more than it is a diplomatic issue. Why? Because we are approaching an American agreement, American elections in November, and if the treaty will be signed between Emirates and Israel in the upcoming weeks before the Rosh Hashanah, which means in the first half of September, it means it will be harder to the American president and also to Israeli prime minister, in case there will be some development in the election field, to boast, with this achievement and to present it as, something that is a deal that is done right now, and this is something of a very serious achievement for both sides. So we already understand from the Emiratis that we are perhaps heading for the October and probably also for the mid-October. Okay, so let us not be surprised when it will be rescheduled, and then finally it will take place a short time before the American elections. The last point is about why this dance that both parties are dancing for probably at least last 2 decades. Okay, so many things had happened during these 2 decades. The Arab Spring, of course, the rise of hegemony of Iran in the Middle East, the decline of the Arab nation states, of course, the second war in Iraq, which of course is part of the decline of the Arab states, and also the perhaps some kind of rise of Iran. And most importantly, realization that came also to Emirates that Israel is not the enemy. We've been reading repeatedly in the Emirati press, in the Saudi press, starting from as soon as 2002. So 18 years ago, yes, that the Arab Gulf states should focus their efforts on resisting, then it was Iran, now it's also Turkey, the Muslim Brotherhood, and other threats in the region, not Israel, because Israel does not pose any threat. So if you ask me, Israel was ready to sign a normalization agreement with Emirates 20 years ago and 30 years ago. It didn't happen because the other party was not ready to it. At the same time, one of the most important developments, I think, and troubling developments, because for us, those who support the establishment of the Palestinian state and the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the sidelining of the Palestinian issue, to the perhaps scaling of the very, very small problem that is probably even not existent on the agenda of both parties today. Is it helpful to the peace with the Palestinians that Israel will have now approach normalization of relations with Abu Dhabi? We're not sure. We don't know yet. This is something that we have to still to find out. But what is quite reasonable to think today, that the Arab Peace Initiative, it remains in its name only, not in substance. The United Arab Emirates are bailing out of this initiative, and they're leaving Saudi Arabia to boil with it alone. So by now, again, the proximity of the American elections, the threat of the annexation that didn't happen, and there are many reasons to why it didn't happen, but in the end of the day, it is being presented to us. It's being framed as an achievement of the Israeli, of both leaderships, actually. The achievement of the Israeli leadership, because they reached something that most of the Israelis are welcoming. More than 80% prefer peace with Abu Dhabi and traveling to Dubai to annexation. And also the Emirati side pictures this achievement as their great achievement, because they try to explain to the outer world, they personally, they stopped the annexation move. And they're designed to also to stop it in the future. As for the Americans, it's quite clear, that Donald Trump will receive his 5 minutes of glory in the lawn of the White House, and his long-term dream, which he was speaking many times. I heard him personally talking about it many times in the Knesset, to fulfill the dream of basically many Israelis without paying the price which is giving land in return. So indeed, Netanyahu didn't give any land in return. But did he sacrifice the option of annexation now and for many years to come? Okay, so this is, I think it's an open question, and I'm sure that my fellow colleagues will refer to it and talk about it after me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ksenia, for not only providing background information about the negotiations over the last couple of weeks, but also asking more questions about the process that we are going to be witnessing over the next weeks and months. One of the things that's, of course, of interest not only to myself, but I think to many people is, we have a tendency of thinking about the Arab-Israeli conflict and within terms of Israel's conflictual relationship with many of its immediate neighbors. And of course, the most famous peace treaties and only peace treaties that Israel has with other Arab states are with Egypt, the signing of the peace treaty in 1979, and with Jordan in 1994. Those are two of Israel's most important strategic partners today, but we can't forget the fact that the peace treaties that were signed were after many decades of hostilities between the two parties. So I want to turn to Dr. Moran Zaga to provide a little bit more information about the UAE. What exactly is the UAE? How does the UAE operate within our region? What kind of relationship did it have with Israel prior to the announcement? And in what areas or spaces of cooperation should we expect these two countries to be operating going forward?
Sure, thanks, Mitchell. So the UAE represents a hybrid system of tribal coalitions and modern statehood. And it's important for us to understand the system if we want to really comprehend the mechanisms of decision-making. And one of the most critical questions that we as analysts will have to face today is the gap between the traditional conception that we had on the glass ceiling, no normalization without negotiating with the Palestinians, and the announcement that broke the ceiling. For years, up until the very recent statement, the official narrative of the Emiratis was that traditional conception. We just follow their own narratives. And I think that the answer to this gap might lie in the state system. The Zayed family is now strong enough in the region and in its own home to overturn its own narrative and to dictate a new order. And this is much due to the centric power of Muhammad, the crown prince, his half-brother, Abdallah, which is a foreign minister, and others in the near circle. We barely heard voices from Dubai or the other Emirates on this step. Now, I think I would like to indicate on two important evolutions that occurred in the country in the past 2 decades. mainly due to the rise of a new generation of rulers of 4 of the 7 Emirates, and might change on what we see today. So the first process is diversification. The heavy leaning on the US military and diplomatic umbrella, and the heavy leaning on the oil industry led to rethinking, led to a new strategy that embraces diversity of economic channels and of international partners. And this led to an extended network for the UAE and for more significant engagement with other countries. Now, the other evolution that I'd like to point out on is the emerging tactics of hard power, in addition to the traditional soft power in its foreign policy. The new rulers brought a new DNA to the political culture of the country, with more daring to its strategic ambitions, and the main goal was projecting power and influence. The soft power included projects like what we saw on the Mars mission, the Expo 2020, the arbitration between Eritrea and Ethiopia, between the Taliban and the US. But the hard power was not less important to deliver this message. And we saw that in the military intervention in Libya, in Yemen, the boycott in Qatar. So the bilateral agreement with Israel falls under the soft power tactics, but it's really a sequel to this dual policy and the trend that we see in the last several years. So it's important this our event in the broader context. And from here, I'll move to your next question, Mitchell. I'll briefly suggest looking at the following opportunities. So from the diplomatic perspective, for the UAE, this move is portrayed as a very bold step, whether the Arab countries like it or not. That conveys a message that the UAE is a regional power, a confident country that can lead and precede others. It really now divides the Middle East into camps of supporters and opponents. This used to be the role of Saudi Arabia, to make other leaders face such decisions, but now it is the UAE that sets the tone. So it's interesting to look at that development. And for Israel, I think that first and foremost, this step is a legendary opportunity for legitimization in the region. And we're not only talking about legitimization for our country, but a country, a partner, who holds a moderate approach toward political Islam and symbolizes modernity and stability. So these shared worldviews between the two countries enables both of them to establish their relationship on a relatively solid ground. And I think the administration here in Israel has a great interest to continue in that direction. And it really should be, the administration should really be attentive to the other side and to understand the way the Emiratis introduced this agreement. The starting point was not so bright. Netanyahu's statement was significantly different from that of the UAE. Now, another benefit for Israel may come from the very nature of the UAE. The Emirati foreign policy is not only going outwards, as I mentioned before, it also has another dimension of shaping the country as a hub for various global events. And that's why a more tangible benefit for Israel can be participation in these events without the many obstacles that exist today, as we already saw in the preparations for what was supposed to be the Expo 2020, but will be the Expo 2021. So Israel will find itself more engaged in the chain of opportunities that are already taking place in the UAE. Will it change the economy of the countries? I think not. It might have a benefit for Israel's economy if it would have opened, if this step would open the gates for other countries. But I think that the competition, the global competition over the Emirati opportunities is so high that the Israeli commodities will find it so difficult to enter, even given a full lasting peace. And on the civil channel, we saw the announcement, many profits for both sides. I think it was deliberate that this is what they wanted to emphasize, such as religious visits to Al-Aqsa, peace tourism, research collaborations, technology, joint ventures on regional challenges. So these are symbolic advantages in the long run, but in the short run, but in the long run, they might lead to great contribution to the region. And also many branches of international companies and organizations are located in Israel and also in the UAE. So this might lead to a more open collaboration. Lastly, I would risk by taking a gamble in saying that I think that the most important part of the package for the UAE is the regional security alliance and the technology that Israel and the US has to offer in the defense industry, and that the UAE is very interested in. So it plays, so the agreement plays also for UAE's hegemonic ambitions and for Israel's domestic politics, a true win-win situation.
Thank you so much. That was really enlightening. We've spoken a lot about the Israeli interests and the Emirati interests in order to get this deal done. But in order to fully understand the scope of what's taking place, I'm going to ask Professor Elie Podeh to weigh in on the regional implications of this decision. And over the last couple of days, both Israeli and foreign journalists have reported that other Arab states are possibly going to follow the UAE's lead. In fact, as of today, Israel's foreign minister, Gabi Ashkenazi, was having phone calls with representatives from Oman. Correct me if I'm wrong. How is this going to impact Israel's regional standing? And also, we haven't spoken about it as of right now, but Elie, could you weigh in a little bit on how this is going to potentially impact the future of Israeli-Palestinian relations?
Thank you very much, Gabi. Good morning and evening to all of you, all over the world. Well, no doubt, I think, the agreement is a milestone as a breakthrough in Israeli-Arab relations. So in addition to Jordan and Egypt, now we have the UAE. I want to remind us all that in the past, Israel had relations also with Morocco, Tunisia, Qatar, Oman, and Mauritania. That stopped with the outbreak of the Intifada in 2000. So that is one thing. It is also a breakthrough because the list of agreement to be signed amount to normalization, even if the word itself is not used. As we know, the word tadbi in Arabic has very negative connotations. And here there might be a change in the Arab perception. But at the same time, I want to remind us all that the amount of normalization treaties signed between Israel and Egypt in 1881 was many, but most of them were not eventually implemented due to the Arab pressure. But now it's a different situation, so I would not deduce from that anything. What will happen next? So, Gabi, you mentioned the possible candidates, Bahrain, Oman, Sudan. These are options. I think it will depend on the amount of criticism the step will encounter in the Arab and the Islamic world. So they are waiting for the time being. Also, let me remind all of us that Qaboos, the Sultan of Oman, died this year. He was 50 years in power, and perhaps his successor would not feel as bold as Qaboos. Oman also is quite close to Iran, and not only geographically. So we have to take it into account. I think that Saudi Arabia is the key. In the past, she adopted a very cautious policy vis-a-vis Israel, though I have no doubt that she supports the move. I have written quite extensively on Israeli-Saudi relations, and I think in general, all Israeli governments, they misread the Saudi position, which since 67, accept Israel along the 67 boundaries. Several times in the 70s, according to my research, the Saudis sent secret feelers to Israel, and they were always rebuffed. Let me also remind us that the Saudis led two Arab Peace Initiative in 1981, the FAID Initiative, and 2002, the Abdallah Initiative. which were also rebuffed by the Israeli governments. Now, the question is whether Saudi Arabia will come and endorse the agreement publicly. For the time being, the silence from Riyadh is disturbing. If they were enthusiastic, I assume they would have reacted more quickly, like Oman, like Bahrain. The stakes are very high, and they will have to receive much more significant concession from Israel, so I think. Does it change significantly the regional map? Thomas Friedman went as far as endorsing the agreement and describing it as a geopolitical earthquake, no less than that. I don't agree, by the way. I think that the agreement validated and strengthened certain visible trends. Regional coalitions have not changed, but rather consolidated. Nobody has suddenly moved from one camp to another. The UAE, along with Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, supported Israel against Iran. What has changed is that the UAE came into the open. Also, the fact that the UAE is attempting to position itself as a major Arab player is not new as well. And the fact that the Gulf emerges as the center of the Arab world following the revolutions in the traditional Arab center of power, this is not new as well. But what has changed regionally is that Israel and Turkey are on a collision course. Iran, of course, is the known devil, but Turkey has diplomatic relations with Israel, and they share some $4 or $5 billion of trade. But Israel's interest in the Mediterranean with regard to energy and gas collide with Turkey, as Israel neutral allies are Greece, Cyprus, and Egypt. The agreement with the UAE further distanced Turkey from Israel. If in the late 50s until the end of the 70s, Israel cooperated with the Periphery Alliance, Iran, Turkey, and Ethiopia, it is now cooperating with the core Arab Sunni countries against the periphery. This is a major change, but it's certainly not new. Has the glass ceiling been broken? As you know, the general thesis in our field, including mine, and including, I think, Mitvim in general, was that in order to move from secret to public engagement in the Arab world, a solution, or at least a major breakthrough, is needed. Understandably, Netanyahu and many observers on the right wing emphasize that they have shattered the premise or the myth. In this regard, I want to offer two thoughts. First, the Emirati step was not given for free. They did get something in return. And second, their move is indeed a crack in the glass of ceiling. Whether it will be a break in the ceiling depends on the coming steps. Oman, Bahrain, if they join, and of course, Saudi Arabia, which is the heavyweight of the Gulf countries in terms of its position in the Arab and Islamic world. But even more important, I think that as far as the Arab peoples are concerned, I believe that the agreement has not changed much. We boast about the peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan, and rightly so. But this is peace between governments and not between people. So the existing glass ceiling is not only with the regimes, but also with the people. And I think that in any way, we are in the right way in terms of Israel's place in the Middle East. I termed my book From Mistress to a Known Partner, and that is exactly the direction which Israel is moving slowly but surely. But I still believe that if we want to be accepted fully as a legitimate player in the region, we have to address the Palestinian issue. Some people may say, well, I don't care about Israel's place in the region, but this is a mistake. And by the way, all Israeli governments since '48 made attempts, mainly behind the scenes, to play a role in the region. We play basketball and football in Europe. We participate in the Eurovision, but we do not play politics in Europe. We play in our neutral theater of operations, the Middle East and Mediterranean. Is the agreement a breakthrough also in the Palestinian-Israeli relations? Well, here the answer is more complicated. One of the Emirati motivations for signing the agreement is that they have succeeded in suspending or stopping the annexation in the West Bank and saving the option of the two-state solution. Let me emphasize that the issue of annexation was already a dead horse, and therefore, in essence, the Emirati did not achieve much. But it is true that in theory, at least, the question is still alive and on the table. And it is important that Netanyahu backed away, though he denies it, of course, which means that no Israeli leader will be able to implement it. And if he did, he would pay a heavy price internationally. But I think that the Emirati achieved something else which is overlooked, a say in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That means that if Israel would rethink in the future of taking a unilateral step like an annexation, they will face the threat of cutting the ties with Egypt, Jordan, and now the UAE. This is a consideration that every Israeli government will have to take into account. So to a certain extent, Israel will be a hostage to its Arab affairs. So, and that will be my last point. What are the chances of now reviving the Israeli-Palestinian negotiation? I think very slim. And I want to cut it short because I have a lot to say in this regard. Now I will be happy to answer questions. So let me just say the following. My fear is that the despair and frustration among the Palestinians, which has been boiling during Trump's administration, we know all about Jerusalem and about peace plan, may lead to a rapprochement between the PA and Hamas, and may lead the younger generation into the streets. Logic dictates that at some point, the pent-up frustration will blow up. And the bottom line is that the excellent achievement of Israeli-Emirati agreement divert the attention from what is the core of the problem, the Palestinian issue. Since the beginning of the conflict, we prefer to deal with Arab and not Palestinian leaders. So I think that it'd be very nice to visit Dubai, maybe Doha in the future, but I meant, of course, Dubai, but Ramallah is more important. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elie. We're going to turn to Dr. Nimrod Goren for the final comments of our first round, but I just want to remind everyone that if you have questions for any of our speakers, please to submit them in the chat box, and following Nimrod's comments, we will then get to the Q&A. Nimrod, I think that what Ksenia and Moran and Elie have been able to do is they've been able to paint a very complex and at the same time very colorful picture of what's taking place in the region. Can you talk about a little bit about how this announcement has been received by the Israeli public, by the Israeli government? We know that the Israeli government is in theory on the brink and could, in fact, in a couple of weeks, declare early elections once again. And could you also kind of articulate, if we're looking at a negotiated process between Israel and the United Arab Emirates in the coming weeks and months, which government ministries are going to be responsible for this process? Which ministries are going to be tackling various angles of these negotiations? And how might this process affect Israel's broader regional foreign policy?
Thank you, Gabi, and thank you for all of you for being here. Good to see some friends and partners and colleagues. I will try to address your question beginning with how the agreement or the breakthrough with the UAE has been perceived within the Israeli public debate. First, looking at the Israeli media, we see a very broad positive coverage of the developments. Front headlines, reporters going to Dubai, exclusive interviews, articles about the potential of relations. It's as if the media was very thirsty for some good diplomatic regional news and is now buying into that very much. It reminds a bit of the peace festivals that we used to see in the 1990s, in the days of the Oslo Accords, and basically we've been missing that for quite a while. Within the political system, you see overall agreement that better relations between Israel and the UAE is a good thing. So people in general support the bilateral relations. There's not much opposition in Israel to the essence of better bilateral relations. There is criticism on how the Palestinian issue has been handled within this context, whether it's coming from the left or the center left or the pro-peace group saying, well, this should not be framed as an anti-Palestinian, anti-two-state solution move, or from the right wing that are critical of Netanyahu's decision to suspend annexation. And as Ksenia rightly pointed out, when public opinion is being evaluated in Israel, we see that around 77% of the Israeli public, when they have to choose between the two, either annexation or Israel-UAE agreement, they definitely go for the agreement with the Emirates and not for annexation. Annexation, we saw it throughout the past few months. Israelis didn't really care about it. They were not enthusiastic for it, and there was no big political capital for Netanyahu to mobilize around that. I just mentioned that 2 years ago in the Mitvim Annual Foreign Policy Index, we asked Israelis which Arab country they would like to visit the most, and the most popular answer was the UAE. Okay, not with high numbers. More Israelis did not want to visit any Arab country, but still the UAE was number one on the list. Basically because the UAE represents a model that is very different than the Israeli stereotype of the Arab world. If Israelis used to think, what could we gain from cooperation with Arab countries that were perceived as failure, then UAE is a success story, both economically, in terms of international prestige, and the perception is that there is a lot to gain, mostly on civilian, economic, political, and also security issues. So if we go beyond security to other issues, the question that you asked, Gabi, which governmental entity or agency should be heading or leading the relations, is becoming very relevant. And we see it play out in the news, some quarrels about whether it's the Mossad or the Ministry of Defense or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who is leading this process. Netanyahu was asked, I think just yesterday, whether or why didn't he update his Minister of Foreign Affairs or his Minister of Defense about developments. Gantz and Ashkenazi, both from the Blue and White Party, were not in the loop. He was asked, why was it so? And he was saying, well, basically, Netanyahu was doing that for years, working on that for years. They're here for only a couple of months. He also said that they may have led to leaking it to the media or to Iran or to whatever. So the foreign minister was not involved. Traditionally, when you speak about Israel-Arab relations, the responsibility for ties with countries with which Israel does not have diplomatic relations was at the hands of the security establishment. Most of the content of these relations was security related. But over the last few years, things have changed. And in the post-Arab Spring decade, with different Arab countries, we saw a diversity of topics being discussed, with more civilian aspects coming to the forefront. We saw economic cooperation. We saw bloggers coming from Iraq. We saw Israeli athletes competing in sporting events in Morocco. We saw ministries going to the Gulf. So the civilian aspects of the relations were becoming stronger, and therefore the Ministry of Foreign Affairs were becoming a stronger actor. We saw it in the lead up to the Expo exhibition in Dubai, where the Israeli MFA was leading the progress with the Israeli Pavilion plans to be there. But now when things were actually happening, Netanyahu kind of changed a route and got back the power to the security establishment, whether it's the head of the Mossad who is going to the UAE or the head of the National Security Council who is leading the governmental process of leading this process forward. And I think Gabi Ashkenazi as foreign minister now has a chance to claim his position, because when he was appointed foreign minister, in his opening speech, he was saying, I am going to pursue relations with countries in the Arab world that we do not have diplomatic ties with. So now, whether there will be early elections and when there will be early elections, Gabi Ashkenazi can leave a mark and make the foreign ministry much more significant in ties with the UAE, especially if there will be an embassy in the making, and especially with the agreement emphasizing civilian and non-security issues as the process of this normalization going forward. But the question, and this is the final category I would like to touch upon, is not only who leads the foreign policy, but what is the foreign policy? What kind of content are we bringing into these relations? What is the diplomatic goal that these relations are going to serve? And I think that this agreement should be leveraged to promote Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking and not to prevent or bypass that. The breakthrough with the UAE creates an Israeli discourse which is different than what we used to see. People are talking about peace, they are talking about regional cooperation, they are talking about opportunities. They are not talking anymore about annexation, they are less speaking about security threats. It's a chance to broaden this pro-peace discourse also to the Palestinian issue. We need to emphasize to the Israeli public just how central the Palestinian issue is to Israel's national interest, and just how important is moving forward towards peace, because it's an issue that defines the fate of Israel as a state, as a society, because it enables much more regional cooperation. What we see with the UAE without a price tag on the Palestinian track could be achieved much more with many more countries in the region. And we should also emphasize that better relation with the Arab world should eventually be brought back to support peace process with the Palestinians. Because one of the benefits of such a deal is that Israelis feel more secure in their neighborhood. When you have such agreements being reached, it's very difficult to maintain the mindset that we live in a hostile neighborhood with countries wanting to extinct us. This is not the case anymore. So Israelis may be more open now to thinking about compromises in their negotiations with their immediate neighbors. And once there will be a different Israeli prime minister, or once there will be a different American president who will go back to the international consensus of a two-state solution on the 1967 borders, then the fact that Israel has broader diplomatic engagement, more open ties and relations with countries in the Middle East could be an important asset that should be utilized to promote Israeli-Palestinian peace. And thinking in advance on how to do that when conditions are ripe, this is one of the goals that we at the Mitvim Institute will be looking at in the coming months. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nimrod, and thank you for all of our speakers and for you, the audience, who submitted so many questions. We're likely not going to have enough time to get to all of them, but we will try. The first questions that I have will be directed towards Ksenia. In particular, one of the members of the audience asks about the future facility or embassy type building. Is it that we could see the construction of or establishment of a UAE building that is less than an embassy, so long as President Trump is in office? How do you understand the nuances or differences between an embassy versus a consular building versus something that simply has a flag? And in addition, Ksenia, if you could just talk a little bit about the Arab Peace Initiative, which was presented in 2002 and is seemingly also another diplomatic endeavor that has been ignored or bypassed by the announcement that was made by Israel and the UAE this week.
I'm muting. Thank you, Gabi. Regarding the first question about what type of embassy. So these are the small details, the small nuances that may allow to the Emiratis to somehow defend themselves from the criticism, which although, it's not, you cannot even compare it with what was felt by Egypt in the 70s, less so by Jordan in the 90s, but still. So there is some criticism still, and there was a reason why the Emiratis, why the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they kept emphasizing that the embassy will be established only when there will be the solution for the Palestinian problem. So we do not know, again, we do not know the details of this agreement. And there is a lot of secretivity, I think, around it. What I can say is that regardless of what Trump might think about it or not, there is also so much more that the Emiratis can actually do. This is first. Second, we do not know who will win the American elections. Okay, so there is a question mark there. And whether, the next president of the United States, if it will not be Trump, will he care that, we are talking about embassy and or consulate or some kind of trade office or diplomatic mission and so on. And the last perhaps issue is that the ceremony will be held sometime soon, whether it will be in 2 weeks or whether it will be in 6 weeks. Anyhow, we do, appreciate that it will happen before the presidential elections. But who knows how many time it will take to actually to open an embassy, okay, and when it will happen and where it will happen. So there are a lot of things that will be left for the future, and there it will be already either not significant at all or something that Israelis might quietly, but yes, live with it and say, well, this is as far as we can go right now. So again, this is not the essence of the whole thing. It is, we are talking about normalization of relations, and there is no, at least for now, there is no intention from the Emirati side to be satisfied with the official agreement, with the envelope only, and not with the substance. They are into for the substance. They are interested in the Israeli innovations. They are interested to invest perhaps in the Israeli high-tech medicine. You know, this is happening for years. Everybody knows exactly what kind of personalities had a right from the UAE to have treatment in the Israeli hospitals. So I think that this agreement, regardless of whether it will be consulate or something else, it will be filled with substance. Now, regarding the Arab Peace Initiative, I was able to speak during the last few weeks to some officials that had something to do with negotiating the Arab Peace Initiative, with presenting the Arab Peace Initiative, and who defended the Arab Peace Initiative for some time. However, their voices, and I'm talking to some of them were Egyptians and others were Saudis. So we do not hear these voices anymore. We do not hear that the Saudi Arabia itself promoting the Arab Peace Initiative anymore. So does it mean, you know, they do quote it sometime from time to time, but they do not actively try to sell it, you know, as the best possible solution. So this is when Trump is in office. What will happen if it will be not Trump but Joe Biden? Will, you know, the Arab Peace Initiative be resurrected again? Will it become again the, you know, something that can be sold again, you know, to the both sides as the best, perhaps reference, the best beginning, the best starting point for negotiations between Israeli and Palestinians? Perhaps, you know, but what we are seeing right now with Emirates, and there was a question about other states that might normalize relations with Israel. You know, I personally bet on Bahrain, you know, because I heard from some Bahraini officials personally many years ago, you know, that this is something that they are willing to do a lot. So we will not be surprised by that very much. But it all means that it's undermining the essence of the Arab Peace Initiative, because if all of the states will normalize relations with Israel before any Israeli and any Palestinians were sitting together next to the negotiation table, what does it mean? That there is no Arab Peace Initiative, that everything has happened, what is promised in this initiative, without any progress on the Palestinian track. The last thing that I wanted to refer, there was a question by Arif Svatanka, I think, regarding the opposition to the deal with the Emirates. So yes, there is ideological right in Israel. It's not very huge. It's not represented, by the Likud party or by Benjamin Netanyahu. But there are still some people who would rather have annexation and have control over Gush Etzion and Ma'ale Adumim and Jordan Valley, and not travel to Abu Dhabi. Okay, I personally know these people, so I'm surprised that they're only 20%, by the way. Okay, because it means that all of the others who are talking about the whole of the land of Israel are ready to trade it for 7-star hotels and dancing fountains. But this is what we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Ksenia. Moran, one of the most significant potential successors for Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas is Mohammed Zalan, who of course has over many years established very close relations with the Emiratis. How does his relationship and his engagement with the Emirates play into this deal, and how can this deal in some way, shape, or form influence or impact domestic Palestinian politics?
So we haven't heard yet from Mohammed Abbas, but we know that the UAE is desperately looking to see a different leadership in the Palestinian Authority. There is a huge frustration from the present ruler of the Palestinians. And we saw that in, I think it was a month ago, in the humanitarian aid for the coronavirus that they sent with the airplane that landed in Israel and was destined to the West Bank. And the Palestinians refused to accept this humanitarian aid because of the political hostility between the leaders. So right now, this is their only card, the Khlan. But it might be too weak to play the dice right now. So it's a matter of time until they pull him out of the hat or see if he can find himself in the local politics. In the meantime, he stays on the sideline.
Thank you so much. Elie, there was a question for you about your comment regarding Israel, not getting this deal for free. Can you talk or elaborate a little bit more about what you meant by not getting it for free? From an outside perspective looking in, Netanyahu has agreed to not go forward with the annexation plan, which, of course, those in the Israeli audience know that prior to July 1st, there was no articulated plan by the government of what it would annex, how it would annex, et cetera, et cetera. So even before the planning stage, Netanyahu has been able to, avoid the annexation conversation in exchange for a normalization process with the UAE. So can you articulate some of the other costs or things that Israel has to trade in exchange for this process? And if you don't mind, if you could just talk a little bit about how this fits in with the politics of the Israeli right and the continuation of settlement growth, that would be deeply appreciated. Thank you.
Okay. First of all, just a note about the question that you asked Ksenia before about embassy. Let me just remind all of us that Morocco, Qatar, and Oman, they had trade missions. It was not an embassy. Mauritania was the only state that had an embassy. And for various reasons, they decided that the time was not right to establish full diplomatic relations, so they called them something else. What will happen with the Emirati is still unclear. They are talking about embassies, so we'll have to wait and see. Regarding your questions and to relate it to the right in general in Israel, let me say the following. First of all, I said that the Emirati got something, but I didn't say that they got a lot. In fact, they got very little. This is true. I think that it is agreed. They may think differently. They pose as if they received a lot, but obviously they received very little. But at least, they have something. This is one thing. But I added one thing which in my mind is important and is less discussed and is somehow, it is hidden because it's not immediate and it is something that we'll see in the future, is that the Emirati got a say in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I mean, until now, they were outside the game. And like Egypt and Jordan, I mean, whenever something arises between Israel and the Palestinian, okay, like an operation, military operation in Gaza, or whether it was even in Lebanon, the Arab states immediately, they reacted. So the obvious and immediate step was to recall their ambassador. That is easy, and that's what they have done. Now, for the first time, the issue of annexation really threatened Israeli-Jordanian relations. And it's no wonder that MBZ, he said that he saved Jordan, or he helped Jordan. This is rightly so, because Jordan was in a very awkward position regarding the whole issue of annexation. So therefore, I think that it is very important for the Emirati now. We remember and we understand also from the other presentations that the Emirati are positioning themselves as a kind of leadership. They are playing a role in Yemen, or at least they did play a role in Yemen. They are playing a role in Libya, in Sudan, elsewhere. For such a country to play such a significant role, I mean, this is quite amazing. And they have the hard power and they have the soft power. So now they position themselves into a place where they can also affect the discourse on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And I think that is important. So they gained here something which is maybe not tangible in the immediate realm, but in the future, it will come very obvious. Now, I think, 2 points which are somehow contradictory, because on the one hand, it is very important that Netanyahu, he withdrew from the whole idea of annexation. And as I said, I think that will be a symbol or an example for others as well. This is true. But at the same time, he brought something else, which he or others that will replace him can use, saying that, listen, we were very successful with the Emirati, with peace for peace. It's no longer land for peace. And of course, that this logic is not relevant to the Palestinians. So you can bring, I mean, this was exactly the policy of Yitzhak Shamir. Yitzhak Shamir said, I'm not going to give land for peace. I'm going to trade peace for peace. And of course, nobody wanted to talk with him at that time. But now it seems that that idea is on the agenda. And these are bad news for anyone who wants to go in the direction of solving the Palestinian issue, because people in Israel, they can come and say, listen, we can live, we got so much with the Emirati, we can get quite a lot also with Palestinians if we'll be insistent, and we don't have to give, or we don't have to give much. And here, I think that the model of the Israeli-Emirati, although it's not relevant at all, because it's far away, didn't have war with Israel and so on, still Israelis might take that the wrong conclusion and try to apply to this case. And in that respect, I go back and I want to just to reemphasize, what Nimrod said as well. I think that this is now the task of the Israeli government to come forward and to suggest something. I've said it many times and in the past, and for many of you, it will come as a surprise. Israel has never initiated a peace proposal, never. For a country that is talking all the time about peace, to learn that it hasn't published, we just mentioned 2 peace agreements with the Saudis offered in the past, but the Israelis, they have never offered. So this is the time to offer something tangible to the Palestinians to see whether we can go forward in tandem with the Emirati and the Gulf countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Elie. Nimrod, a question for you. All foreign politics, some would argue, is local. So what are we looking at in terms of the impact of the announcement and the news of the last couple of days on the prospects of new elections? Does this strengthen Prime Minister Netanyahu's hand to call for early elections, or does it position him in a place in which he would rather not go towards elections? Notice the framing of my question that Netanyahu is the primary decision maker, but if you feel otherwise, please articulate.
Sure, and I will relate also shortly to other points that were mentioned. Now, if you look at the Israeli political system after such a long period of political instability, the formation of a government, one can conclude that Netanyahu will not enable Benny Gantz to become prime minister in November 2021, as the coalition agreement requires. So the assumption is that there will be early elections in Israel, and Netanyahu will be able to choose the exact timing of that happening. And one exit window is next week, when the Knesset supposedly is supposed to agree on the budget for next year. If that is postponed, it could be another exit at 3 months' time, around November, and then if not, it could be in March 2021, the decision for elections, not the actual election. I think currently, at this point of time, it's too early for Netanyahu to go for election. I think he will agree with blue and white, or try to agree, postponing the budget for another 3 months, and then breaking the government perhaps in November, looking at what will happen with Corona, etc. This is not a game changer politically. Okay? If you look at it, the agreement, it definitely gives Netanyahu some diplomatic boost, but that's an issue that Netanyahu already felt quite strong on. You could see within his campaigns in 2019, 2020, just how much he was bragging about Israeli-Arab cooperation and breakthroughs without having such an agreement. So definitely it will be a very good photo op on the White House lawn with the Emiratis, maybe with the Bahrainis. But when you look at his political base, that's not the game changer, maybe on the contrary. Netanyahu will face criticism from the political right on dropping annexation. I think that's a component within his electorate that he will have to deal with in the months before elections. So it may be better for him to do the UAE ceremony as early as possible, get it done early September, and then work in the next 3 months to propose other things that will appeal to his right-wing voters. And that relates to the question about settlements. Because if Netanyahu drops annexation, it doesn't mean that he cannot advance all kinds of new settlement initiatives, whether it's in E1 in Ma'ale Adumim or Givat HaMatos in Jerusalem, and that may be his replacement. And for the international community that put so many efforts in trying to block annexation, they will now understand that annexation is not the whole story. And occupation is not only annexation, it can go on in a way that further jeopardizes the two-state solution, even if annexation is off the table. I think that will be what we will maybe see in the next month, how Netanyahu moves to appease his right-wing base without alienating the UAE on annexation. Some other points I would like to relate. First, about the Arab Peace Initiative. I think for many years we've been saying that the API should be updated. All of these documents looking at the Israeli-Palestinian peace process are usually formulated in the early 2000s. Clinton parameters, Quartet Roadmap, Geneva Initiative, API, all more than 50 years old. A lot of change in the region. I think to make the API relevant, it should have been adapted over time to what has been happening on the ground. And maybe now, when people question its relevance, is a chance to actually do so. UAE, we need to remember that it's not an actor only in the Middle East, but it's increasingly becoming an actor in the Eastern Mediterranean, which is also a region that, Gabi, you care about, but Israeli foreign policy is also emphasizing. The UAE has been cooperating with Israel's allies in the East Med, with Greece, with Cyprus, with Egypt, also with France. It's been issuing statements against Turkish activities. So for Israel, it also increases its alliance system within the East Med, although the UAE is far away. And the issue of the UAE-Palestinian leadership rivalry played out quite significantly over the last few weeks. Some of you may remember the Emirati plane that landed at Ben Gurion Airport some weeks ago, supposedly carrying medical equipment to aid the Palestinian Authority, which the Palestinian Authority declined to accept. And eventually that aid was moved to Gaza. So the sense among the Palestinian leadership was that the UAE is playing the Palestinians for the sake of legitimizing normalization, the same way they did with the article in Yediot Achronot, and that very negative rhetoric between UAE and the Palestinian leadership eventually may be a task for Egypt or others to try and change, especially if there is a new president in the White House and the UAE will try to have better relations with the Democratic Party, then somehow mending ties with the Palestinians and finding a way for the UAE to be constructive in the pursuit of peace, I think would be an important thing to do.
Thank you, Nimrod. We're just about wrapping up. I have a final question that I think relates to several questions that were asked by some of our audience, and that relates to the American involvement in this story. Several of you alluded to the fact that it's possible that in November there will be a change in administration and that we'll have a Biden administration instead of a Trump administration. So this is a question that whichever one of you would like to answer are free to answer. But my question is twofold. To what degree is this process or the statement, the announcement that took place this past week, to what degree is this a culmination of efforts and activities of the Trump administration, or has this been an American foreign policy goal for some time? And what we're seeing is the fruition of a several decade-long process. The second question, or second part of that question, is how or in what way do you see this announcement and this process changing or impacting American foreign policy in the region, whether it's a Trump administration or a Biden administration? Thank you. Who would like to respond? Any volunteers?
Well, I'm willing to say something.
Great, thank you, Elie.
Well, first of all, I'm a historian, so I guess my answer will be quite obvious. It's a combination. It didn't come suddenly. I mean, no doubt the immediate trigger was the Emirati ambassador's article in the Yediot Achronot. I mean, if you read it backwards in perspective, he wrote annexation or normalization. You know, he was saying, he wasn't saying peace agreement or peace treaty between Israel and the Palestinians or normalization. That was the quote that he put. And that triggered, I think, the immediate negotiations. However, you have to take into account, and Moran, she wrote an excellent paper in Mitvim about that, about the history. And in my book, there is also a chapter on Israeli-Emirati relations. So you could see the consolidation since 2001. Ephraim Sneh, the Minister of Transportation, was secretly the first minister to visit the Emirates. And since then, there were quite a lot of other contacts along the years. So therefore, I think that what we see here is a culmination of a dual process of things that went along the years and those specific elements that were working during the recent months, including the corona and what happened during this time. I think that the Trump administration wanted to divert maybe the attention and to give some boost to, you know, the election campaign and so on. But as much as I can see, I don't see it turning into such a major issue in American politics. Well, maybe there will be some kind of a ceremony at the White House, but still, is that the major issue in American politics today? I mean, with confronting the coronavirus in the States and the miserable treatment of the administration. So I don't see how it can affect him very much in a positive way. But the bottom line is that if and when Biden comes to power, it will affect American policy, no doubt. There will be a major change. And maybe this transformation will allow a new opportunity. Because as long as Trump is in power, I can't see really an opportunity taking into account the current affairs relations between the Palestinian Authority and Trump.
Okay.
Thank you.
With that, I think that we are going to conclude our webinar. I'd like to thank Elie and Ksenia and Moran and Nimrod for sharing their thoughts. I'd also like to thank all of you from all over the world, literally, for taking part and asking sharp questions of our speakers today. You can learn more about the Mitvim Institute and our activities on our website, mitvim.org.il. And please follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We're looking forward to doing more webinars like this in the coming weeks and months, provided that the global situation remains as such. And with that, thank you once again, and stay healthy.
Thank you.